They say the scariest stories aren't the ones filled with monsters or shadows in the dark. The scariest stories are the ones where everything looks normal, right up until the moment it isn't, where the danger isn't loud, it doesn't scream, it just waits. Patient, quiet, invisible, and by the time you realize something is wrong, everything you loved is already gone. That's where this story begins. Not with panic, not with chaos, but with calm. A calm so perfect that no one noticed what was hiding beneath it. This is the kind of story that makes you question the people you trust, the relationships you feel safe in, the homes you think protect you, because once you hear what happened, you'll realize how terrifying it is when evil doesn't look like evil at all. Her name was Claire Matthews. To everyone who knew her, Claire represented everything steady, kind, and grounded. She wasn't the loudest person in the room. She wasn't the center of attention. But she was the kind of person everyone remembered. The kind of person people trusted without hesitation. She had that warmth that made you feel like you could tell her anything. She listened. She understood. She cared in a way that felt real, in a world full of people pretending. Claire grew up in a small coastal town where life moved gently, where mornings smelled like salt and rain, and nights were quiet, except for the wind moving through trees. Her parents loved her deeply. They raised her to think, to question, to observe, and she did. From an early age, Claire had a way of noticing everything, the slight shifts in people's tone, the pauses in their sentences, the way they smiled when they didn't really mean it. She understood the unspoken world long before most people even realized it existed. She wasn't fearless, she was careful, and that makes what happened to her even more haunting. Claire was never reckless with her choices. Every decision she made seemed carefully considered. She didn't jump into relationships. She didn't trust easily. She didn't let people in unless she felt completely safe, which is why everyone believed she was safe with him. His name was Adrian. They didn't meet in some dramatic movie moment. Their story didn't begin with fireworks or chaos. It began quietly, the same way it would begin for millions of people around the world. A conversation, a laugh, a sense of comfort, something familiar, something easy. Adrian was charming in the softest possible way, not in-your-face confident, not overwhelming, just gentle. Attentive, he remembered little details. He asked about her day, not because it was polite, but because he genuinely seemed interested. To her parents, he looked respectful, educated, kind. To her friends, he seemed like the safest choice. Stable, calm, reliable. That word again. Calm. They built a life together, slowly, carefully. No rush, no sudden decisions. Adrian supported her career, encouraged her ambitions, celebrated her achievements. At least, that's what everyone saw. But behind closed doors, something else quietly began to form. Not control, not aggression, nothing dramatic like that. Just an invisible tightening of space, an expectation to explain little things. A question here, a concern there, subtle shifts in tone when she made plans, suggestions disguised as care, little emotional nudges that didn't feel wrong until they did. But even then, they didn't feel dangerous. They just felt heavy. Claire stopped going out as often. She called her parents a little less. She slept badly. But like so many people do, she blamed life. Stress, pressure, the speed of adulthood. She told herself she was fine. Everyone believed her. Until one evening changed everything. It was early winter, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. Claire left work at her usual time. Cameras captured her locking up, smiling briefly at a co-worker, then walking to her car. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just routine. That night, she was supposed to video call her mother. She never did. The next morning, she didn't show up for work. Her supervisor assumed traffic, then maybe illness. But when she missed an important meeting she had been preparing for weeks, concern turned into alarm. Messages went unanswered. Calls rang endlessly. By late afternoon, her parents reported her missing. Police arrived at the home she shared with Adrian. He opened the door calmly, always calmly. He said they'd had a quiet evening, dinner, conversation, nothing unusual. He said she went to bed early. When he woke up, she was gone. He assumed she needed time alone. Maybe a break, maybe air. But Claire never did impulsive things, and she never disappeared without telling anyone. Her phone was missing. So was her purse. But her car was still parked outside. Her planner lay open on her desk, filled with detailed schedules, reminders, upcoming plans. Everything about her life was documented, structured, planned. She didn't plan to disappear. Investigators initially did not treat it as a crime. There were no broken locks, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle. An adult woman leaving home was not illegal. But her parents knew something was deeply wrong. Their daughter didn't vanish. Something happened to her. As detectives pushed deeper into the timeline, cracks began to show. Not huge fractures, not glaring lies, just hairline fractures of truth. Adrian's emotions felt controlled, too controlled. His story remained consistent, but almost too rehearsed. He never stumbled over details, never hesitated, never showed confusion. Just a carefully measured narrative delivered with steady composure. Where most people would break down, slip, contradict, panic, he remained calm. Calm enough to make people uneasy. That uneasy feeling grew when digital forensics revealed something interesting. Claire's phone had been turned off deliberately. Not dead, not lost. Power button disabled. A conscious act. And the last recorded activity on it was in their house. Not outside, not on the road. Inside. Adrian said he didn't notice. Investigators didn't believe him. Still, there was no body. No direct evidence, no obvious crime scene. Just a woman gone. And a man whose calmness could either mean innocence or something else entirely. As days turned to weeks, the search grew. Volunteers gathered. Posters went up. News stations covered the disappearance. Her parents stood on camera, voices shaking, begging anyone to come forward. Adrian stood beside them, expression gentle, eyes slightly glossy, voice soft. He said he loved her. He said he wanted her home. He said everything right. But something in the way he said it felt wrong. Friends began to speak up. Slowly, hesitantly. They described Claire's gradual emotional withdrawal, how she stopped laughing the same way, how she hesitated before answering certain questions, how she once said softly, "I don't feel like myself anymore." Police revisited the house. This time, they looked harder, and in the smallest, most unexpected place, they found the first real clue. Not blood, not hair, not something dramatic, just something quiet, something ordinary, something that shouldn't have been where it was. And that tiny detail was about to change everything, not just for the investigation, but for the truth people thought they knew about love, safety, and trust. Because sometimes the people who seem safest are the ones you should fear the most. And from this point onward, Nothing in Claire's story feels calm anymore. The clue the investigators found wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't something that would make headlines or shock the world at first glance. It was small, almost insignificant, hidden beneath the quiet order of the home. Tucked beneath a piece of furniture in the study, there was a thin strip of fabric. Torn, delicate, out of place. A soft pale thread from the sweater Claire had been last seen wearing. It shouldn't have been there, certainly not wedged in a gap low to the floor, as if something had pressed or pulled. When they examined the area more closely, they noticed faint scuff marks along the wood. Not scratches, not damage, just subtle signs of movement. Something had been dragged or pushed or braced there. Something that told a different story than the one Adrian had been calmly repeating. But still, there was no proof of violence. Nothing decisive, nothing prosecutors could pin down with confidence. Just another uneasy whisper in a growing storm of doubts. Investigators requested permission to search more thoroughly. This time, they went slower. They noticed how immaculately clean everything appeared. Too clean. Not spotless in a natural way, but precise, deliberate, like someone had taken great care to erase anything that might have mattered. In the kitchen, a faint trace of bleach lingered in the seams between tiles, not enough to be obvious, but enough for trained eyes to recognize. Adrian said he had done regular cleaning. He liked his house tidy. He said it with that same calm tone, unbothered, unfaltering. But the pattern was starting to reveal itself. He never seemed afraid. He never seemed unsure. He was never shaken, and that in itself was terrifying. As the investigation deepened, they began pulling more digital records. Emails, devices, backup storage. He had not counted on them retrieving. That's when they found the messages. Not arguments, not confessions, something more chilling in its subtlety. A series of drafts, unsent emails, unfinished thoughts he had typed but never delivered. They weren't addressed to anyone in particular, but they spoke volumes. Lines about feeling watched. Lines about controlling outcomes. Lines about not letting people leave. Not dramatic threats, just a mind rehearsing rationalizations. A mind preparing answers. A mind planning. Meanwhile, an unexpected witness emerged. A neighbor who hadn't initially thought their memory mattered. They remembered something strange on the night Claire disappeared. A soft sound echoing from the house. Not yelling, not chaos, just a thud, a muffled movement. Something heavy shifting, and then silence. Always silence. Pieces were coming together, but they formed a puzzle with missing edges. No body, no single moment that screamed guilt. Just layers of unease, building into something undeniable. Claire's parents refused to give up. They pushed authorities to look beyond the walls of the home, to retrace areas Adrian mentioned casually, places he referenced in passing conversations, parks, remote stretches of coastline, quiet spaces where no one would look. That's where search teams discovered something else. Buried just beneath loose soil, near a forested overlook, carefully hidden among roots and stones, they found a small jewelry piece. Something deeply personal. Something Claire treasured and rarely went anywhere without. A delicate pendant with initials engraved by her father years ago. It wasn't broken. It wasn't lost. Naturally, it had been placed there, sir. Adrian said he had never been there. But his phone records disagreed. Late-night pings traced to that same area. Multiple visits, each one unaccounted for. For the first time since Claire vanished, Adrian's calm began to crack. Not in front of investigators, not in public, but in small, involuntary ways. His hands trembled slightly when he signed documents. He blinked longer between questions. His breaths grew heavier when backed into contradictions. Not panic, just the faint shadow of pressure. Interrogations resumed with a different tone. Questions weren't gentle anymore. They weren't patient. They were direct, relentless. Timelines were dissected, lies confronted, inconsistencies replayed until silence became louder than answers. They asked again and again, "Where is Claire? Where did she go? What did you do?" Adrian didn't crumble, he didn't shout, he didn't confess. He simply shut down, cold, still, a wall no one could break. Legally, the case remained complicated. Suspicion wasn't proof. Emotion wasn't evidence. And the justice system demands certainty even when reality trembles with truth just out of reach. Time passed. Seasons changed. But the shadow of what happened never faded. People learned to look at Adrian differently. Not with trust, not with sympathy, with unease. He moved quieter, avoided crowds, avoided conversations. He lived like a man, carrying a ghost no one else could see. Claire's parents never stopped searching. Every distant field felt like a possibility. Every body of water felt like a threat. Every news headline with the word unidentified forced their hearts into their throats. Years later, the case still lingers suspended. Not closed, not solved, not forgotten, just hanging. A story without an ending. A question without an answer. A silence that feels heavier than any scream. And the part that disturbs people most is not just that Claire disappeared. It's the terrifying idea that someone can appear so gentle, so kind, so perfectly calm, while quietly erasing another human being from existence. No witnesses, no confession, just absence. An absence so loud it echoes. And somewhere in that final quiet night, the last person Claire ever trusted might have decided that if he couldn't keep her, no one ever would. That is the kind of calm you should always fear. Years slipped by, but the case never loosened its grip on anyone who had been touched by it. Some disappearances fade quietly into the background of unsolved files. This wasn't one of them. It lingered like a wound that refused to heal, reopening with every rumor, every anonymous tip, every sudden whisper that maybe, just maybe, Claire had finally been found somewhere. But nothing ever came. What most people didn't know was that while the world gradually turned away, the story hadn't actually ended. It had simply gone quiet in the same way it always had. The danger in this case never shouted. It breathed softly. It watched. It waited. And then, years later, something unexpected happened. It didn't start with a breakthrough from technology. It didn't come from a guilty conscience suddenly confessing in the middle of the night. It arrived as most truths do in stories like this, not as a revelation, but as a fracture. A new detective took over the case. Her name was Marianne Cole. She had no personal history with Claire, no emotional biases, no old assumptions clouding her view. What she did have was patience, and patience is exactly what this case demanded. Marianne didn't come in, guns blazing, promising answers. Instead, she did the quiet work. She read every document, every interview, every transcript, every email, every photograph, every obscure scrap of detail stored in dusty folders no one had touched in years. Where other people saw repetition, she searched for patterns. Where others had stopped questioning, she dug deeper. And slowly, she noticed something no one else had. Adrian had never once contradicted certain parts of his story, even under pressure, even when cornered, even when timelines shifted around him. There were specific details he refused to change, as if anchored to them. People assumed that meant truth. Marianne thought it meant rehearsal. The more she studied him, the more she felt something wasn't right. Usually, liars trip over the parts they make up. Adrian didn't. His problem wasn't inconsistency. It was precision. His emotions were carefully placed where they would be expected. His pauses were perfectly spaced. His sadness was measured like a script, practiced hundreds of times in a mirror. Marianne had dealt with people like him before. People who didn't break. They didn't panic. They planned. She didn't focus on where Claire might have gone. She focused on something no one else had truly dug into. Why she disappeared. Not the surface-level explanations. The psychological truth hiding beneath years of silence. Marianne started interviewing people again. Not to get new facts, but to listen differently. She noticed that everyone described Adrian the same way. Gentle, thoughtful, calm. Always calm. And yet, beneath every compliment, there was always a slight pause, an unspoken hesitation, a feeling no one could articulate. He never felt fully real to anyone. Just perfect. And perfection isn't human. Meanwhile, Adrian lived a careful life far from the town where everything fell apart. He had a new house, a quieter job, few friends. He rarely dated and never seriously. Loneliness didn't seem to torment him. He existed in a detached, almost clinical way, like a man who had accepted his solitude as a fair exchange for whatever he had done, or whatever he was hiding. But silence has a way of cracking over time, and it finally did. Not through Adrian, through the house. When his property needed structural maintenance due to foundational shifting, construction workers were brought in. Floors needed lifting. Beams needed reinforcement. Old hidden spaces that hadn't been touched in years were opened. Behind a false panel in a wall most people didn't even know existed, they found something. Not a body, not remains. Something worse. Evidence of someone who had lived silently in fear. Small notes written in neat handwriting. Not diaries. Not dramatic confessions. Fragments, thoughts, little emotional splinters. Sentences like, "I don't feel safe anymore. He watches everything. If I leave, I don't think he'll let me." One line, written shakily, crushed Marianne's lungs when she read it. "If something happens to me, it won't be an accident." The papers had been stuffed out of sight, pushed into a space no one was ever intended to find. They belonged to Claire. Confirmed through handwriting analysis, her last unheard words didn't scream. They whispered, and every whisper pointed to Adrian. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of fear. Real, undeniable. That changed everything. Now the case wasn't just speculation, not just suspicion. A hidden psychological prison had existed within those walls. Investigators searched again, harder, slower. This time, they weren't just looking for physical harm. They were looking for control. And they found it everywhere. Hidden recording devices, not modern ones, old, small, well-placed, watching patterns, tracking movements, listening not to conversations, but to breath, to footsteps, to silence. Adrian had been living with complete control over another human life, but control doesn't explain disappearance. So the only question left was, where was she? Marianne kept searching, but something was off. Something wasn't aligning. Then one evening, while staring at the old interview logs, she saw something that froze her completely. It wasn't a clue. It wasn't a confession. It was a sentence Adrian had casually said years earlier when he didn't think it mattered. Some people can't survive without being watched. At the time, it sounded philosophical, maybe emotional. But now, knowing the truth, it sounded like something else. Possession. Marianne didn't sleep that night because she realized something terrifying. Everyone had always assumed only one of two things had happened. Either Adrian killed Claire, or Claire escaped and disappeared forever. But what if neither was true? What if love in his mind wasn't something you walk away from? What if love in his mind wasn't something you break? What if love, to him, was something you keep? And what if you don't keep it in memory? What if you keep it physically? Investigators expanded search radiuses, not outward, inward, into structures, into basements, into places where one could remain hidden from the world but not dead. What they finally discovered wasn't cinematic. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't something television would dramatize. It was something real-world horrifying. They found a concealed underground chamber in a property linked to Adrian through a shell identity he thought would remain invisible forever. Legal loopholes, purchased under another name, forgotten on paper, but not in reality. Inside that hidden structure wasn't carnage, there wasn't blood, there wasn't death, there was existence. Evidence of someone living there once. Food storage, books with pages worn thin, clothes folded carefully, personal belongings that belonged to Claire. But she wasn't there anymore. Not alive. Not dead, just gone. Again, there were signs the place had been used for years after her disappearance, then abandoned, quietly, calmly, without a trace, just like her. The chilling part wasn't the captivity, it was what it revealed about Adrian. He didn't just want control. He didn't just want possession. He wanted godlike authority over whether someone was allowed to exist freely. He didn't see people. He saw ownership. When interrogated again, older now, less invincible, Adrian didn't shake. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply said softly, "Some people need to belong to someone." And that was the last honest sentence he ever spoke. Legally, the case still struggles. No body means no final closure the world accepts. Without that undeniable evidence, everything remains suspended between horror and law. But morally, emotionally, psychologically, the truth is clear. Claire didn't disappear. She was erased piece by piece until she no longer had the strength to exist independently. And when she finally tried to leave, he made sure she never truly could. Even now, no one knows where she is. Maybe she escaped and never looked back. Maybe she didn't survive. Maybe she is somewhere in the world, living quietly, breathing freely, but haunted by invisible walls Adrian built around her mind. And maybe that's the most terrifying ending of all. Not knowing whether the person you loved was murdered or survived something worse. Because death ends suffering. But living after that kind of captivity means the fear never truly leaves. Claire became a ghost long before she disappeared. And years later, she remains one. Not because she vanished, but because someone decided her existence belonged to him, and the world still hasn't figured out how to bring someone fully back from that kind of darkness. The case remains open. Her parents still wait. And those who study the story teach one lesson again and again. The most dangerous monsters don't roar. They don't rage. They don't scream. They smile softly, speak gently, and remain